Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending which state you're dialing in from. My name's Ellen Litchfield. I'm I do a bit of work with Farmers for Climate Action, and I'm going to be your facilitator. I'm just going to do a welcome to country first, and then we'll get stuck into it. So Farmers for Climate Action acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting all across Australia. I'm meeting on Arabana land in northern South Australia, and feel free to put in the chat where you are calling in. And this webinar is really a focus on the power of young people have in Australia and how they're shaping agriculture already. I'm really excited to introduce you to these four powerful advocates for Australian ag. And these young leaders are really taking the challenges and driving change in their communities and beyond. We're really honoured to have them here today, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time at the end of this for questions as well. In this webinar, we'll be diving into the many ways that young people are shaping a better future for agriculture, from tackling the impacts of climate change to advocating for their sectors and communities. These four leaders represent all the different ways you can bring about change and support the industry that we all love. We'll also be exploring the important role that organisations and movements play in empowering young people as well, and the opportunities that are available for those of you that want to get involved. So whether you're at school or uni, work in the ag sector, are a young farmer, or just passionate about the agricultural industry and want to get more involved, I invite you to join us for an exciting and enlightening discussion. So we will hear from each speaker, and then at the end, we will leave some time for some Q&As. We'll be using webinar mode, so we won't be able to see or hear you, but please put comments in the chat and questions in the Q&A box. All right, first up, we'll hear from Kate McBride. Kate is a fifth-generation farmer from Western New South Wales. She's a Healthy Rivers ambassador and has become an advocate for many issues facing country Australians, from mental health, the lack of services, and climate change. Kate has completed a Bachelor of Commerce at Adelaide University and has begun a Master's in Global Food and Agricultural Business. She's on the Western Local Land Services Board and now works for the Australian Institute as their parliamentary liaison based in Canberra. You may have seen her on Q&A or recognise her from her recent work shining the light on the disparities in life expectancy for people in the bush compared to the city. Thank you, Kate. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Ellen. I'll give this a crack sharing my screen. Thank you for that introduction. So yeah, I'm in Canberra, and before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the country that I'm coming from today, which is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this country and their elders past, present and emerging. The other thing that I always do as well is acknowledge the country that I come from. So Barkindji country out in the far west New South Wales. And I acknowledge that because I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for the teachings and the knowledge sharing that I've got from the traditional owners out that way. And I always have around my neck in a necklace a bit of Barkindji country dirt that sort of keeps me grounded and connected at home as well. So I suppose I should get cracking into a little bit about my story and my leadership journey. And then, yeah, hopefully we have some time for questions afterwards. So I always started with this slide, and it used to look really different. And a few years back, someone raised it with me that my who am I was actually just where I worked. And this person knew me and they said, Kate, you're a lot more than just where you work. So I sort of tried to change it up a little bit more. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you maybe get a bit of an understanding of not just where I work, but yeah, who I am a little bit too. The one thing I did do this morning is I went to my friends though, and I said, how would you describe me? Can you give me 3 words? Not just where I work, not anything like that. And their things for me were passionate, empathetic and rural. I suppose working in a public policy think tank in Canberra, I do come across as very rural. But I am a bit of a jack of all trades. And as you heard from the range of different work that I do, I really like it that way. I like sort of being able to connect with a range of different people, whether that's in my sort of Canberra capacity here as parliamentary liaison, which involves working up at Parliament House with all different political parties. I'm also a researcher, so working with people in that space, or when I go back out home and next week I'm chairing a weeds committee out in Western New South Wales. So sort of a bit of two different worlds that come together. But what it allows me is to connect with a massive variety of people from totally different walks of life and really get to know them and understand them the best way I can. But I am country born and bred, and as said, 5th generation farmer. And I sort of always thought that the place that I'd be would be at the station, ending up on, it's a 500,000 acre sheep property where I grew up. And the joys of succession, which I'm sure other people around this room have probably had a struggle as well. My plans didn't exactly work out the way that I'd planned. And for a variety of reasons, I actually stepped away about 1.5 years ago. And that sort of turned my world upside down a little bit, because I had these plans of what my life was going to look like and where I'd end up. And that changed a lot. And thankfully, I had a lot of incredible people around me during that time. And I can still maintain my connections to the bush. But I love what I'm doing now. And yeah, I'm really thankful for the change in my life. And yeah, so I live in Canberra now, the bush capital, and I'm absolutely loving it. But what I've done is, with my work with the Australia Institute, and this is sort of what I think is really important for country people to be able to do, is be who they are, but then also say what they need. And when I came to the Australia Institute, they said, we want you to move to Canberra, and we want to give you essentially what is my dream role. And I said, I'd love that, but I can't completely disconnect from home. I need to keep my rural roots. I need to really stay connected to it. Can we do 3 weeks on, 1 week off? And so they've allowed me to do that, which means that I can get out home about a week a month, which is really important for me. And it keeps me fulfilled and going. And it's been really special. So finding a place where I could work, that I could do effective work that I wanted to be doing, but in a way that I needed to, because it wasn't just a want. I said to them, if you sit me in front of a computer screen for months on end, then I'm going to probably lose it. So they've been really great with that. So in terms of like voice and whatnot, I sort of thought I'd go into a little bit about my journey and what that looked like. You're going to hear from some incredible people over this webinar, and I don't want anyone to sort of think like, wow, they're doing such incredible things, that could never be me. The thing is, right now, if you've only just gotten started, that can't be you, because you need to work up and you need to start small, and we all have. The photo on the right is me standing in the river, and it was really practicing early on how to talk to camera, because a couple of years ago, I couldn't do it at all. So starting small, and like getting bigger. For me, I never wanted to be like the face of anything and play in this space, I suppose. But I found my passion, and it was the Darling Barker River. And some of you might have like heard a bit about the work that I do in that space, but we had massive water problems. And it was almost like a fire, like something was sparked inside me. And I just said, I really need to do something, because there was a great deal of other people doing some stuff, but we all needed to come together. And so for me, it was about finding that passion and starting with small little videos. And over a few years, they gradually got bigger and bigger. The other thing with this though is not everyone has to be standing in front of the camera. There's within movements and causes, there's a place for everyone. And sometimes that means telling other people's stories rather than telling your own story. And I think that's really important as well, is finding your place in the world and within a cause, whatever that looks like, where you can be most effective and you're also enjoying it as well. So it used to be a bit more behind the scenes for me. And then over the years, that's transitioned to be a bit more forward facing. And I think that's been really important for me as well. But the one thing right along is staying true to yourself and staying authentically you, no matter what it is. And the other thing my friend said to me today, when I said, describe me, they said, Kate, you're a chameleon and you can fit in anywhere, but you are always you, no matter where you are. And I feel like they sort of almost don't go together, but somehow I think if you're staying authentically you, that's really important. And it's something that is really important for me to maintain and continue as well. And my last slide, because I don't want to do the old death by PowerPoint, but it's actually kind of funny, this one, because I use this slide really regularly, not just for this webinar. And I always have that Farmers for Climate Action thing, because there's a bit of a story around this one. And so I started my journey in like being a vocal person in the bush sort of thing for water issues. And that gradually got bigger. And as the drought happened, I started working in that space a bit more, and it's gradually grown to be more of a voice for rural Australia. But one thing that I was always too nervous and didn't want to touch was actually talking about climate change. And it's because I think, you know, part of it is political as well. But for so long, I thought if I speak out on this, I'm going to get knocked down. Like I just can't put myself out there and do that. And it wasn't until last year on Q&A that I finally went into this space. And it was a big risk almost. Like I wasn't sure whether it'd be good or bad, but I knew that this cause, like I believed in it, and I just needed to find the courage to actually do it and speak on it myself. And I did, and I got nothing but sort of applause afterwards. The only other feedback I got was, what took you so long? We've been waiting for you to come into this space. And I think, you know, it really is about being brave and not pushing yourself too far, but pushing yourself out of that comfort zone a little bit. The other thing on my slide is, if not me, who? If not now, when? And I think that's just such an important thing to remember in this space as you become leaders within the ag space and are given a voice, or create a voice for yourself, I suppose, as well. I was back in Menindee the other day, and Menindee is like the place I call home now. We've got the most incredible lakes. If you haven't been out there, you have to come out there. Big Menindee advocate, you can see. But I was sitting at the cafe and I was chatting to a Barkinji elder, and I said, Auntie Barb, like, I'm just so happy here. I don't want to go back to Canberra. I want to be here and spend my time here. And she turned to me and she said, girlie, we need you in Canberra right now. You need to be in there fighting for us, and Menindee will always be here for you to return home to, but that's where you need to be. And it's something that's really stuck with me, and it meant a lot coming from Auntie Barb as well. But yeah, I just think like it's an opportunity that I've got here, and I've got the privilege of having a voice now and being able to speak for and with rural people. And I think that's a real privilege, and we have to recognise as well. But it does take a lot to stand up and to play in these spaces. And so I think it's really important that as young people in this space as well, we all need to be supporting each other. And, you know, when you put yourself out there and you show courage, you're not always going to win. And sometimes you are going to come off second best. And when people do, I think we really need to make sure that we're lifting them back up. And, you know, you're not going to win every battle, but being there for one another. And it's something that the ag community I've seen really strongly, and it's incredible the amount of like advocates within this space that are just constantly checking in on each other, and people that I've never met in person but I call close friends. And it's the joys of social media, I suppose, these days, is being able to check in on people and support them and do everything that you can. So I reckon I'll leave it at that. I must be pretty close to my 10 minutes. But yeah, thank you for listening. And as well, the other thing that I do try and do is make myself really accessible, and I want to help. I've had a lot of incredible mentors over the years, so I'm always there on social media or email whenever if anyone ever wants to get in contact. I'm happy to help, because I had incredible mentors coming up when I was, so happy to be that for others. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was fantastic, and a lot of those comments really ring true for me as well. I've been really lucky enough to find that balance, being on the family station, cattle and sheep station, as well as doing some work with Farmers for Climate Action a few days a week. Really, yeah, fills my cup in both senses, to make sure that I feel like I'm doing effective work and promoting causes that are really, that I'm really passionate about. And yeah, I think that's a really great message. Try and find your voice, and that'll evolve over time, but yeah, just continue working on that. Okay, we're going to head over to Nicholas Blanford next, our next speaker. Nicholas is a farmer from Merlu in East Gippsland. He's a strong advocate for young farmers to develop the skills needed to deal with the challenges and opportunities within agriculture in Australia, including those presented by climate change. He currently sits on several different advisory boards, including the Victorian State Government Young Farmers Advisory Council and the National Centre for Farmer Health Advisory Board. So we're really grateful to have you here with us, Nicholas. And Nick, and I'll pass over to you now.
Good afternoon, and thanks for that introduction. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm presenting today, which is the Gunai-Kurnai, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So Ellen, as Ellen mentioned, I work on my family farm in Merlu in East Gippsland, and this is where I grew up and sort of began my journey in agriculture. And as like many people at some point in high school, which was for me sort of in the late 90s, you start to think what you're going to do with your life, and I probably was a bit unsure of which pathway I was going to take. And thinking about it, one of the big influences on that decision was probably the Millennium Drought, which had a pretty significant impact on East Gippsland. And I don't think there was a great deal of positivity around our industry at the time. And sort of speaking to some friends recently who've come back to farming, most of them were really pushed away from a career in agriculture. So I think it's a really important point that even in the tough times, it's important to remain really positive about our industry. And as you can see that we still have lots of challenges. We're still going strong in 2023. So I obviously did decide that agriculture was the pathway for me. So I enrolled in uni, but the first thing I really needed to do was get a bit of life experience. So the first job I had in the industry was gherkin picking. I can't imagine the impression that I set turning up wholly unprepared on that first day, but it did make an impression on me, and I still have the mark across my back from the sunburnt that I got on that first day. And I did stick to it, but I didn't have my driver's license at the time, so I really relied on my mum and dad to sort of take me to that job, and the 5 a.m. starts didn't really sit well with them. So I was fortunate enough that once I got my driver's license, I was able to sort of pick up a different job and worked in local shearing sheds in that gap year. So I think the second point I would make is that there's always work available in agriculture. So after finishing uni, I sort of picked up a rural sales job in the southeast suburbs of Melbourne. And that was a really fascinating location that served crops from sort of apples to zucchinis and everything in between. And it taught me a lot about the industry and the supply chains involved. And the job really came about through a connection with a friend of mine. So I think that my next point is that the relationships and networks are really important in agriculture and finding your next opportunity. So it's really important to keep cultivating those. So after my partner finished her PhD, she moved to Canberra. So I also needed to find a job. And I was fortunate to land one with the CSIRO, working as a technician for a wheat breeder. And this was also really fascinating. It taught me the importance of ag research and how good foresight and vision was required to stay in front of the industry challenges and trends. So my next point is that there are career options in agriculture almost anywhere, even in Canberra. And sorry, Kate, about that one. Through this time, we've sort of been working on our family succession plan. And in 2016, the opportunity sort of came for me to come back to the family business. And this sort of coincided with starting a family. So initially I was working on the farm 3 days a week and being a stay-at-home dad for the other couple of days. And about 12 months in after I came back, I realised a few things. Firstly, that the farmers who found time to engage with their industry outside of the farm were often the most successful. Secondly, there were a lot of programs and opportunities for young farmers to participate in. And thirdly, that the values I had were not represented in the local political and industry leadership structures. So from then on, I made a really conscious decision to participate in as many programs and opportunities as possible. And one of those was to participate in the Climate Smart Fellowship run by the Farmers for Climate Action in 2019. And it was a really excellent program, and it gave us access to sort of many exceptional experts working in the climate change field. And I think there was a couple of takeaways that I really took from that program. Firstly, that I did know a fair bit about the issue of climate change. And secondly, that I wasn't alone in the ag industry and thinking that climate change was an issue that needed addressing. And at the end of the program, it was really put back on the group to work out what we were going to do to make an impact in our communities. And to start with, I was pretty unsure of what steps to take. And it was sort of coincidental that at the time, our local climate action network started up in my hometown. And from that, there were sort of opportunities came along, and that was to present to a parliamentary inquiry into the impacts of climate change on Victorian communities and to engage our local council to try and declare a climate emergency. So I really took those on. While I didn't necessarily achieve what I wanted to with those opportunities, I learned a really valuable lesson that every door you walk through builds your network, but it also helps to open more doors. So after that, I applied and was successful in gaining a position on the Victorian State Government's Young Farmers Advisory Council. This has been a really great experience, sort of to understand the function of the public service and government in relation to agriculture. And some of the issues we've engaged on, I think, sort of like workforce issues around COVID, the changes in Crown land camping, and sort of the climate change policies as well. So the primary production climate change adaptation action plans, the Victorian Agriculture and Climate Change Statement, and the Ag Sector Emissions Reduction Pledge. And from this role and sort of being involved with the FCA, there's been a lot of opportunities come up. So I've recorded a podcast with AgVic, spoken on the Victorian Country Hour at Triple R Radio in Melbourne, even working with my local learning and education network to do some promo videos, as well as being able to join other advisory boards I've mentioned. So like the East Gippsland Shire Ag Sector Advisory Council and the National Centre for Farmer Health Advisory Council. And like, I'm not a particularly confident speaker, but taking these opportunities is really sort of taking me out of my comfort zone, which has been great. And just back to the Young Farmers Advisory Council, there is a recruitment round coming up for the next iteration of the council. So if there's any young farmers or industry professionals online in Victoria, I would really encourage you to apply for that role. And even if you don't think you're qualified anyway, apply anyway. One, it's a good opportunity to practice going through a recruitment process, and two, the limitations we place on ourselves are often much greater than those that others see. And the other thing I'd probably like to do is promote the other opportunities for young farmers in Victoria that are run by AgVic through the Young Farmers Network. There's things like the business boot camps, really important in developing that financial literacy, the Young Farmer Scholarship, and the Young Farmer and New Entrant Mentor programming. And these are really great touchstones for young farmers beginning their careers. For me personally, I think taking on these positions does take time and it does take sacrifice. But I think for me personally, it's made me a much more organised and better operator. And the sacrifice I did have to make is probably my mediocre sporting career, but that's not that big of a deal. The other point I make is, again, it doesn't need to be a national or state committee to have an impact. And personally, I'm really proud of the work that I do as part of my local Landcare group and network. There are important programs coming through the Landcare agriculture pipeline, such as those opportunities to value the natural capital assets on farm. And I think it's really important that young farmers engage with those local Landcare groups. They can be a bit frustrating, and I understand they can be a bit dull, but I think it's a really important place to get involved and a great starting point. The other thing that I've been involved in recently, I was lucky enough to participate in the Gippsland Community Leadership Program. And that was an amazing opportunity for my own personal development. And I think one of the best parts of doing that program was it was based on geography and not industry. So the diversity of the cohort was really amazing. And I think sometimes in ag, we get a bit too insular and don't engage with people outside of our industry enough. So I'd encourage all sort of young farmers and people not to neglect their own personal development, as there is a myriad of leadership and development programs available targeting young farmers. And from my point of view, they're well worth the time away from farm. I was reflecting on the theme of the webinar, sort of harvesting hope. And on Tuesday this week, I was participating in an interview with a researcher from Lund University in Sweden, who's investigating the impacts of extreme events on people and their livelihoods across a number of locations around the world. One of those is the agriculture sector in East Gippsland. A lot of the conversation was about drought and sort of extreme rainfall events and sort of the anxiety that builds due to the impacts sort of on my own family business and the landscape. And one of his final questions was, are you hopeful? And I took a minute to consider my answer. And I think I am really hopeful for the future of my business in agriculture. And I think the reasons I gave, that everyone needs to eat and clothe themselves, so there's always going to be demand for our products. But I think the other thing is that I have a belief in the collective, that as a community, as an industry, and as a globe, we'll come together to address the challenges of climate change. And I think part of that is I'm exceptionally appreciative for organisations like Farmers for Climate Action, for the leadership they have shown in this space to build this community. And the last point I'll make is that while many of us are lucky enough to work on farms, and this probably extends to everyone, and it does sound a little bit woo, but I think it's really important to ground ourselves in our landscapes and take the time as often as possible to appreciate the amazing environments that we live in and work in. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicholas. That's great. And yeah, some really interesting points there. And, some of those echoed, what Kate's doing, and also, bringing on some new perspectives as well. And I think that's a really, really strong, powerful point that you made at the end there about, you have a belief in the collective. And, I think that's probably really the role that organisations play. So, organisations like Farmers for Climate Action is really just building those networks and joining these people together, because as you and Kate both mentioned, when you first started, talking out on climate action or sharing your views on that, you felt like that you would be the only one that was going to talk about that, when in reality there's 78% of farmers believe in climate action and the need for that. So yeah, really great points. Okay, so next we're going to hear from Caitlin McConnell. Caitlin is a 6th generation grazier from Toogoolawah in Queensland. As well as working on the family beef property, Caitlin is a senior associate at Clayton Utz, specialising in agricultural legislation and policy, focusing on food and water law and climate change litigation. In March 2020, Caitlin was recognised as one of the top 50 early career lawyers in Australia as an Australasian Lawyer 2020 Rising Star. In March 2022, she was also recognised as one of the top 16 agribusiness professionals under 40 in Australia. That is a huge achievement. And alongside her professional pursuits, Caitlin is an advocate for youth in agriculture and agribusiness. All right, I'll hand over to you, please, Caitlin.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for that kind introduction. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Jagera and Turrbal land on which I'm here in Brisbane today and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Now, it's clear to see that I wear many hats in the agricultural sector, and as I've been introduced, I'm a sixth-generation farmer, though I must qualify that I am at most a part-time farmer at this stage in circumstances where my work as a lawyer for Clayton Utes generates most of my income. Much like Kate, Clayton Utes, though, have been very cognizant of my need to be on the land and at home, so have supported me for many years in working remotely for the firm from the farm. As Ellen mentioned, we are located near Toogoolawah in southeast Queensland, and we run over 500 head of breeder cattle, utilising cell grazing to maximise pasture growth and soil health. We also have over 100 kilowatts of solar for power generation, which has been returning to power to the main grid since 2010 for rebate as a source of diversified income. And we are in the process of moving into long-term battery storage and agritourism at the moment. Now, significantly, my family property was settled in 1841 by my great-great-great-grandfather David, and subsequent generations of my family have contributed heavily to healthcare, agriculture, education, and importantly, anthropology in Australia. We are recognised at Cresbrook as the oldest identified family business in Queensland and one of the oldest in Australia. And I feel very fortunate that our family have had a rich and affectionate intergenerational history with the Dungaburra people since our time of settlement, even to present day with current elder Auntie May Masters and her daughter Vanessa. Now, growing up, I wasn't aware of the significance of our family history or our home. I was just a kid on the farm that loved nothing more than to wear boots, a big hat and tag along with Dad. But it was actually as a teenager and the effects of the millennium drought, which had a profound effect on my parents' financial and mental well-being, the hardships of which, coupled with my own ultimate diagnosis with clinical depression, that resulted in my choosing to pursue a career off farm, because many like my generation, as Nicholas said, did that in order to obtain a steady source of income and of course were encouraged not to be farmers. However, it was in my early 20s that I found, whilst I was studying and working in law, I realised just how integral the farm and our history was to my very being. And I knew that whatever professional career path I pursued, I wanted to ultimately end up back at home. Interestingly, and I think this is another intergenerational issue, it wasn't until recently my dad was reluctant to allow me to have any involvement in the family business, which is actually why over the past decade I've embraced selected extracurricular opportunities in the ag sector in order to get that agri fix and the professional development that I so craved. Having gone through boarding school for 8 years, my first port of call was actually to reconnect with my local community. So I joined the Toogoolawah Show Society and became a rural ambassador for several years. I was then appointed to the Royal Queensland Show Junior Council in 2015, which enabled me to connect with like-minded young Aggies in Brisbane who were in similar circumstances to me. And in 2017 was appointed to the RNA Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the RNA, which now supports young Aggies and rural and regional communities throughout Queensland. In 2019, I was appointed to the board of the Future Farmers Network alongside Ollie, which is the only national organisation, not-for-profit organisation dedicated to supporting young people in Australian ag across all commodities. And I joined the board in circumstances where I actually wanted to use my legal skills and experiences in advocacy to date to better support other young Aggies like me, most of which were told not to be farmers, in order to actually help change the narrative and stigma associated with choosing to make a life and a career on the land. And that has extended to, I guess, my experiences as a rural woman, and our acute awareness of the roles and responsibilities placed on us, not only in the home, but in communities and business. And I regularly acknowledge that my professional success is due to the incredible network of rural women that have championed and supported me throughout my career, which is why I've recently had the honour of joining the board of RRR Women, now in its 30 years, which is an organisation built on the values of community leadership and connection for the purposes of supporting rural and regional women in Queensland. Recently, and in my personal capacity, I've also joined a mentoring program facilitated by my old high school for the purposes of mentoring a Year 12 student who's interested in pursuing a career in law. And I've recently taken on a Year 10 student from the Toogoolawah State High School at the farm for the purposes of assisting him to complete his Certificate 3 in agriculture. These opportunities of which I would have jumped at if they were available when I was a teenager. So I'm grateful to have the platform and ability to support these two and hopefully many more in the years to come in this way. So I guess from that background, how does climate change and my interest in that play into all of this? And having reflected on that, it really came back to 10 years ago, around about 10 years ago, I read The Third Plate, which is a book by renowned chef Dan Barber. And he followed various farming communities around the world for the purposes of ascertaining and then ultimately concluding that for the sake of our food, our health, and the future of our land, Western primary production practices really required radical transformation. And it was interestingly that book that changed the way I looked at conventional agriculture at a time when I was so impatiently wanting to be back in the bush or even just at home. And it was at that time, it was critical because I was a little embarrassed given the nature of big agriculture. I was quite embarrassed at the small size of our property and our operation. We only have 1,000 acres. But it was that book that actually opened my eyes to the incredible work that my dad had already been doing for some time in respect of agrivoltaics and regenerative agriculture at a time when those aspects of ag weren't known, let alone supported. And he was doing that all for the purposes of diversifying our income stream in light of the detrimental changes we'd seen in weather patterns during my lifetime. And it was since then, since reading that book and sort of having my eyes opened, I've been drawn to many, many more books focusing on food security, regenerative agriculture and natural capital, and also the correlation between gut health and mental health, which are personal interests that ultimately culminated in me studying a Master of Laws at the University of Melbourne. And it was during that study that, again, the most significant issue that kept appearing in lectures and journal articles was actually climate change, and critically the role agriculture can and I guess and must play, not only in reaching net zero, but also in the satisfaction of the fundamental human right to food and water. So in light of my interest in these topics, every career decision or extracurricular involvement I've made since that time has been driven not only by my overarching desire to learn more, but to ultimately use the knowledge that I've gained to educate or assist others. Because as Nicholas said, I'm acutely aware that change cannot be achieved by an individual alone. It must be, and in the case of agriculture, must be done as a collective. So I guess that comes to how am I contributing day to day. So with my farming hat on, and fortunately at the end of last year, I was honoured to be awarded as an inaugural recipient of the Farmers for Climate Action Climate Smart Farming Scholarship, which is giving me an opportunity to learn from internationally recognised climate experts about carbon neutral farming, and will put me in an even stronger position to continue to work with Dad alongside him, and also ultimately continue the work that he started at home for many years to come. As a lawyer, climate change litigation and the importance of ESG in agribusiness has soared in recent years. And given my expertise, I've actually positioned myself as a specialist in this area at Clayton Utes, having acted for various clients in the space. And I've also been making, in my personal capacity, submissions to some key federal government inquiries including the recent inquiry to food security in Australia. And it was actually that submission in which I recommended that there need to be an independent review into the entire food system in Australia, similarly to what has actually occurred in the UK, for the purposes of developing a national food security strategy. And fortunately, it's that submission that has gained some attention and incredibly support from some national bodies like the National Farmers Federation and Melbourne Uni. And I think what is most critical about that narrative is because I'm discussing climate change and agriculture in the context of the fundamental human right to food and water, which is the common denominator upon which even skeptics, and again, Nicholas mentioned this earlier, I think that's the point at which everyone can join the conversation around climate and achieving net zero, because at the end of the day, we all have to eat and drink. And in order to survive, we can't do so without agriculture. It just won't happen. So to that end, and a few tips, whilst I consider advocacy to be important, and reiterating really what Kate said earlier on, obviously I've used my professional skills to ensure I'm contributing meaningfully to the discussion. But advocacy can only go so far, particularly if you're not practicing what you're advocating. But I also think it's clear that we can't affect change unless all of us are contributing. And if there's one thing I want you all to take away from today's session, it's that any contribution you can make, no matter how big or small, is an important one, because all of you today are ultimately, you're the next generation of leaders in the Australian ag industry, and your future in the industry is the very reason why the four of us remain dedicated to doing the advocacy that we do. But we can't do that without the member organisations that we're involved in, or you as a collective supporting and informing us. So if you're not already, I would encourage you to join local, regional or national membership organisations or communities that champion some of these issues that you're passionate about, or even undertake further study to learn more about our incredible industry, because it's through those channels and connecting to those individuals and to us that you can actually help make sure that we have a strong and viable industry for generations to come. So to that end, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you all today. And I'll now hand back to you, Ellen, to welcome Ollie.
Thanks, Caitlin. That was fantastic. And, a lot of really interesting words of wisdom there, and finding your community. I think that is so important, and we've heard from all the speakers that is a key way that you can exercise your voice and make sure that your views and the things that you're passionate about are on the schedules, and feel supported in that as well, because even if it doesn't feel like it, your local community or wider organizations will there's plenty of other people that support those views as well. And I also appreciate the changing the stereotype of the rural woman on the land, which I think there's a place for all different personalities and types, and it doesn't just have to be CWA making scones. That's valid, but also there's a lot of other women on the land as well. So that's really important. All right, we're going to pass over now to Ollie Lievre. Ollie is the founder of Humans of Agriculture. It's a storytelling platform that looks to connect, engage, and inspire those people within and towards agriculture. If you're on Instagram, you've probably heard of it, and it's a fantastic way to highlight the human side of agriculture. Since 2019, Ollie has shared hundreds of stories through his weekly podcast, videos, and written content. He has worked in fresh produce export as a business development manager in an ag tech startup, corporate food and agribusiness advisory, and brand and marketing roles in leading agribusinesses, but has now been able to dedicate himself full-time to Humans of Agriculture, which is really exciting. All right, Ollie, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Elle. Hopefully, if my microphone cuts out, this computer has a tendency to do that, so I apologise in advance. But I'm here on Nipaluna country in Hobart, and a bit of a traveller these days, so hopefully the room behind me is clean. And I just wanted to acknowledge, the traditional custodians on wherever everyone's coming to. I think when it comes to agriculture, and especially our work that we do through Humans of Agriculture, we really want to highlight the importance of storytelling. And Indigenous Australians are the oldest storytellers, and they've used stories for tens of thousands of years and hundreds of generations. And I think it's easy to overlook the power that stories have. They can pass on wisdom, they can create connections, and they can create legacy. And I think in agriculture, within our communities, many of us can relate to the characters and the stories that happen in our various regions. And I think from that, it can be a real power in terms of how we actually build the narrative around what agriculture actually is and the importance of it, not just today, but also into the future. So I have got the tough act of following the three superstars. I was going to use a few slides, but I think let's just hit it on the fly. And I think there's probably a couple of things which have come through, and I just want to probably elaborate on it slightly. And I think something that was mentioned this morning, I'm down here for the Australian Dairy Conference, and Barry Irvin talked about the importance of getting perspective. And so for him, he uses the opportunity, he's a bit of a walker. And he said this morning that you have to see perspectives from all over the world, from other people, to talk to people, to get an understanding of what the world actually looks like beyond kind of your own sphere. And I think in agriculture, in all of our own businesses, wherever we are, it's so important to step away and go and see what looks at it from the other side. And I think that's something I want to touch on, and that really has been a key driver behind what Humans of Agriculture is all about. And I think, as Caitlin, Kate and Nick have already elaborated on, agriculture is a fundamental human right. It's so critically important to people every single day. It has an incredible opportunity in terms of creating a better world into the future. But at the moment, particularly here in Australia, people have never been more disconnected from agriculture. Yet the importance of it and why we need to get people understanding agriculture is absolutely critical to creating a better world. So a couple of things, I guess, about me, and slightly different to our other three panelists. I grew up in Sydney. I'm a born and bred city boy, and I guess fortunate that I chose a career in agriculture. I think we are seeing a shift. But for me, I fell in love with farming, and probably for all the reasons that so many of you did. It was the fun and games. It was chasing sheep, riding motorbikes, everything that kind of goes with that. And I left school, went farming down through southern New South Wales, up through southern Queensland, and then headed over to Canada for a little bit as well. So definitely spent a lot of time running around. And as Ellen, you alluded to in my bio, I've done a few different things, and it's either that I just get itchy feet and decide to leave jobs pretty quickly, or maybe I just wanted to understand more about it. But this passion for ag was really fueled through my uncle. And I guess just seeing and getting opportunity through it. And I guess a real tipping point for me was at the age of 12, a bloke who was my uncle's neighbour called and said, we need a hand doing some sheep work. Ollie, can you come and help us out? And I think, like, it's amazing how certain life events that you see as you start to look back actually have a severe impact in terms of the person you become and kind of what drives you. And what Dave kind of showed to me as a 12-year-old kid from the city was that agriculture as an industry has open arms for anyone who's willing to come in, have a go, and the little life lessons you can get from people like Dave of making sure you're not dawdling and running to a gate will actually set you in good stead for life. On that, I did want to, I think what Kate and definitely Caitlin and Nick as well kind of touched on was about this conscious decision to get involved in the industry more. And for me, that probably began pretty early on. In 2015, I made and looking back on it, it was through a scholarship application that I really wanted to get more involved in the sector, and I wanted to find opportunities outside of it. And I think at various times in your career, there is the chance to, I guess, get more involved and less involved. And I think today, as I look at the other three panelists and your bios, I guess, like, I've got to be content at the moment that I'm only really doing one thing. And at the moment, that's where my time and energy and focus is. And I think at various stages, knowing that advocacy and I guess that stepping up is going to come, it's going to look different to different people. It's going to be different at different stages. And it's not what works today isn't necessarily going to work into the future as well. But I think probably for me, one thing which has been key in setting up Humans of Agriculture is actually just understanding what are the values that drive me, and then how do we kind of exemplify that through the work we do. And so I think they're pretty simple kind of human values that we can live, whether we're in the workplace or outside. And it's around, when it comes to our work, which is about sharing stories of agriculture, it is about making sure that we're empowering the person who's sharing their story. And so for us, we're not the heroes, we're really just the hosts, and we're walking alongside the people whose stories we share. We want to make sure that we're enjoying what we do. I think fun is so important. It kind of lights your fire and keeps you hungry and passionate about what you're doing. I think curiosity is probably one of the most undervalued things that you can do in any aspect of your life. If it's getting curious to learn more, if you're in a spot of conflict, getting curious as to why that person's viewpoint is what it is, or in terms of actually learning and growing your own understanding, getting curious about things is hugely powerful, and it comes from a really disarming place. The other couple of things that I guess are fundamental to what we're doing at Humans of Agriculture is around being a good human. And so that's in terms of making sure that we're listening, that we're taking the time, and that we're being respectful of others. And especially when it comes to us now having a platform where we're sharing other people's stories, is that we're not here to shoot people down. We're actually trying to celebrate them and find the best way to share their story. And then I think the last one, and it probably flows really nicely into advocacy, is about backing yourself. And everyone else has said it. It's not all bells and whistles. It's not standing on stages. There's a lot of challenging times that come with it. And I think probably that flows into, I guess, my takeaways. And it's probably a reflection of agriculture and maybe Australian society more broadly, but not everyone can be the face of something, whether it's a movement, it's an organisation, whatever it might be. But what is so important, and I guess one of the most underrated acts of leadership, is actually the act of followership. So when you've got people, and when we've got people who are stepping forward into these roles, I think it's really important to get behind them. And a bloke called Richard Rains, who's had an incredible impact on the red meat industry, says it's about putting wind underneath people's wings. And I think in agriculture, when someone's stepping forward, or when we're talking about our industry, it's actually, let's remove the negativity when it comes to things and increase the positive conversations, whether it's about the opportunities that agriculture is creating, that what's happening in your backyard, or in terms of if it's the person who's stepping forward. Because I think for us, the importance of agriculture is fundamental. I think we know it. But when we've got people stepping forward, we really need to get behind them and help champion them. So thank you.
Thanks, Ollie. That's fantastic. And yeah, I think that's a really important point. Positive conversations, and hopefully we have started some today as well. So that's fantastic. I'm going to head straight into the questions because we've not got a heap of time. But we had a question earlier on from Tusha, and I'm going to direct this one to you first, Ollie, and then if any of our other panelists want to join in afterwards, that would be great. So Tusha said, I'm curious about how you think human capital can be attracted to regional Australia as the competition for the limited labour heats up. And I guess I'm going to regional Australia / agriculture because, you know, coming from directing that at you, Ollie, since, you know, you weren't born into it and you didn't have to jump in. So what do you think is going to attract people to it?
Yeah, good question. And I think probably my first point there, I think language is really important. I guess I had to think through when we're talking about human capital, what are we talking about? We're talking about employees, we're talking about real people, we're talking about getting people into our communities. I think as a sector, we talk about labour, we talk about people like they're a commodity, which they're absolutely not. So I think when it comes to, getting incredible humans into our sector, we need to engage with them at a human level. And that comes from connection, empathy. What do people actually look for? And very rarely are two people going to be the same. So I think it's also really important when we're trying to attract people into different roles that we're not just taking a blanket approach.
That's great. Did any of our other panelists want to add anything to that one?
I think there's also the side of it as well. And, you know, I think this is where rural people and people in the ag space can become the best ambassadors for their regions and for wanting to live out in regional Australia, because we know how good it is. And I think, you know, the value of sharing those stories and getting people out there, but also trying to create livable communities where people want to live out in. I think that's just such an important thing as well. And we've got so many incredible advocates for the industry and regions. I think it's great.
Yeah, that is a really good point. It comes back to advocacy again, showing how great it can be to live in these areas and also advocating to make sure that their communities are livable and have the services required. All right. Oh, Caitlin, have you got any points you'd like to add to that one?
I was just going to add that as a continuation of that, and I think where we're at in the exciting discussion around food security and the awareness of food insecurity in Australia, but then also the circular economy discussions that we're seeing, I think drawing the ability to draw people to rural and regional communities and the ability to shore up our food security really relies, as you said, Ellen, in shoring up those services surrounding those communities, and the complementary role that the energy sector, the healthcare sector, the education services, every single facet of our life and livelihoods are founded in the discussion around agriculture and food and fibre and that fundamental human need. So we need to make sure that when we're discussing about how do we draw people in, we're having food and fibre and that fundamental human right as a basis, and then that feeds into the circular economy discussions and energy and healthcare and education and that sort of thing.
Yeah, great points. Thanks, Caitlin. All right, I might move on to the next question, and I'll direct this one at you, Nicholas, since you were quiet on the last one. And as a young person, how can you best influence the people that are in a position to make the decisions that are required for real change?
So probably similar to one of the things that I echoed in how I spoke. I think it's participation. It's sort of when opportunities arise that you participate in them and sort of take as many opportunities as you can. And that'll give you the opportunity to kind of open more doors and build relationships. And when you build those relationships, then you can have more influence. I think that's probably, what I'd say.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Did anyone of our other panelists want to speak on that one?
I think the thing is that you can't do it alone. And so finding a crew that are going to work with you and like think strategically, you're never going to come in and solve any massive problems by yourself, and recognizing that we're all just cogs in the machine working towards something. I think it's really it's awesome to think that you're part of something bigger. And so I think really when you're trying to influence change, find people that are looking to do the same thing. And not only is that going to be better, you're going to get a better outcome, but I think also it's really humans love connection and we want to work with people. And I think that's what helps fill up your cup as well.
Yeah, I totally agree, Kate. That's a fantastic point. And it comes back again to finding your community, finding a collective that, making sure you're not in the fight alone, and definitely fills your cup. Another question we've got from the audience. So Nick and Ollie both spoke to bringing positivity to the front. What do our speakers do to encourage positive conversations and climate action from an ag perspective? And I think this is a really important point because also, quite a few of our speakers touched on the mental health impacts and the depressive side of climate extremes and the millennial drought. And that is quite often the stereotype of the farmer portrayed in the media. And I think that bringing positivity to the front is really important. So who wants to go first on that question? How do you encourage positive conversation and climate action from an ag perspective? All right, Ollie, you can go first on that one.
How do we create, I guess, through Humans of Agriculture, we're looking at really putting a focus on it. But I think, positivity is a key part. But I also think off the back of that too is realistic conversations as well. And so I think in agriculture, a big part we need to do is support others and where those spaces exist to actually have these conversations, we need to lean in and have them. And I think too often where there is a space, it becomes incredibly divisive, and it's people trying to basically do one-upmanship, which isn't productive. It's not going to get us there. And I think that's when you look at mainstream media, the rise of negativity, more people are tuning away from news than are actually leaning into it. So I think where there's spaces, and what we're trying to do is actually just create those spaces, but I think get curious about them, because I think one of the biggest things, and everyone's kind of touched on it, is it's going to be a pretty bleak outlook if we're all getting negative about what the future looks like. I think humans are incredible problem solvers. So if we know there are problems in front of us around climate change, what time horizons they're over, that's, I guess, really yet to be decided. But there are little things that people can have, and I think realistically, it's where are those spaces? When those spaces are created, how are you walking into them with an open mind and to that beautiful value, which is curiosity? I think that's a great one.
Yeah, that's really, really great. Humans are, we're good at creating problems and we're very good at solving and adapting to them. So yeah, I agree. Caitlin, did you have any comments on how to bring positivity to the forefront?
I think reiterating a lot of what Elise said, and certainly he's created an exceptional platform for our generation to share the positivity that is coming from our industry, using ultimately the hook of some of the challenges that we're facing, but then changing the narrative, which is so important. And I know just day to day, I still get it at home, the negativity that comes from my dad in terms of the problems that we face at home. And I'm constantly trying to come back with, well, here's a solution, here's something. And obviously it's been ingrained in that generation, but I think the more that we can take that negativity and those problems that they have faced and actually demonstrate and discuss and passionately talk about the things that we can do to help implement change or affect change, keeping in mind that there are challenges and there are always going to be, but it's changing that narrative and changing that spin and making sure that we're doing it collectively and bringing that positive, knowledgeable, educational aspect to it as well, rather than just wallowing, which can be easy to do at times. And I myself have had to pull myself out of it a few times. But that's where the beauty of the community and the networks and surrounding yourself with the like-minded people is that, you reconnect with those people and it pulls you out of the doldrums a bit and gets you excited about the industry again.
Yeah, that's great. Nicholas, have you got any other points to bring on the bring positivity?
Yeah, I think working on the farm, I think it's quite good because often you're quite isolated. So when you do get frustrated, you can scream and shout and make lots of loud noise and no one sort of really cares. I think that sort of point of self-care is a really important thing. So for me, like finding those techniques, like it might just be as simple as finding a humorous podcast that I can have a laugh to, so I can sort of step away from that. But I also think, like, obviously we've spoken about mental health challenges, and I think it really is sort of stepping in and leaning into that kind of process. And if you do need help, go and seek that professional help to help you get out of the weeds. I think that's a really important point.
That's great. Thank you. All right, we've probably only got one question really left. Sorry. I might go with this one. So you can answer this one first, Kate, if you like. What do you think are the best ways to communicate up and coming sustainable ag practices to farmers that may be resistant to change? But I think, we can use that sustainable ag practices in a broader term. So, what are the best ways, do you think, to communicate up and coming changes to farmers?
Well, I think it comes down to meeting people where they're at. And I think sometimes within the climate space as well, it can be easy for people to judge others and just assume that that they're doing the wrong thing or they're not where they are. We're all on a different journey, and I think recognizing that is really important. And you can't try and force people down a path that they're not ready or they don't want to go down. So I think that's really important to acknowledge as well, and that these people eventually they will get there, and we're not in control of what they're doing. And I think that's something really important to think about within this space. That sometimes isn't said enough, maybe.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, your comment on and one of the descriptors we've given about you is that empathy is so important. And without the, condescending, you've really got to have a thorough understanding of different production systems, and especially in ag, it's a small community. And I think we really need to make sure that we aren't sort of throwing stones within our community. We've all got to really work together and, as mentioned earlier, bring the positivity to the forefront, and working together as a collective is how we will bring about real change. All right. Thank you so much for joining us and for your speaking, taking the time out of your very busy schedules today. Really, really enjoyed it. I know that I'm getting a lot of comments in the chat. I think that the participants have also gotten a really valuable lesson today from you guys. So really appreciate it. This webinar was recorded, so if you had to duck out or miss some of this, it'll be up on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to check out Ollie's podcast. And you'll probably see Kate on TV, and and Nicholas's plug was make sure you apply for Vic Young Farmers scholarships and the policy panel. And Caitlin, we are excited to see what list you next top, so that's very exciting. All right, thanks so much, guys, and yeah, we'll hopefully cross paths again soon, because ag is a small place in Australia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ellen.